they were a group of Arabians who were not pagans in the way we described them earlier, people who have this remote idea of a God, but they believe, they're so superstitious, and they believe in this polytheism. Lat, Ulat, Uzza, Malat, all those. No, you have now some Muslims who see Islam as a movement that was beginning to transform the Middle East, because Islam was now emerging in the Middle East not only as an improvement on Arabian culture, but also as a movement that was designed as a system-challenging movement to the dominant empires of the time, such as the Roman, who control the areas that would eventually fall into the hands of the Muslims, and the Persians, who were then governed by a dynasty called the Sasanian dynasty. Now, it is against this background that one can talk about the sequence of events, the chronology of events after the death of the Prophet. That's where Dr. Jackson concluded. When the Prophet died, there was confusion among the Muslims. First of all, there were a number of serious political and religious issues coming up. One was, will the Islamic movement succeed after the death of the Prophet? And the Muslims could very well become another Christian group. Had Abu Bakr not responded the way Dr. Jackson told you to Omar about the mortality of Muhammad, that he was a human being, Islam could have been another Christianity, because Muhammad would be seen as a god. But that was, the Muslims were spared that destiny, because Abu Bakr prevailed over Omar, that Muhammad was a human being. He was not a god. Only God will be eternal and ever living. But if Muhammad was a human being, he is subject to the laws of mortality, and he is gone. But he left a message. Now, that was one with regard to Islam in the Middle East. The other question was the rise of false prophets. That was another challenge. They were not only facing a metaphysical challenge from Omar, which could have really changed the course of Islam, but they were also now facing socio-political challenge from people like Musaylima, who claimed that he was a prophet. And he was contesting a fundamental point in the Quran, because the Quran described the Prophet Khatimun Nabiyyin, seal of the prophets. Now, when you have someone in the Middle East of that time claiming that he was a prophet himself, what was he doing to the teachings of Muhammad about the end of prophecy? He was challenging that, and he was challenging the very foundation on which that notion was built. So, of course, this led to what Muslims will call the Ridda Wars. The Ridda Wars. Here now, Muslims were now trying to keep in line all the other groups. This is one major event in the Middle East with regard to Islamic history, how the Muslims were able, under the leadership of Abu Bakr, who didn't last long, he just ruled for 2 years, and he died, and was succeeded by Umar bin Khattab, who was a father-in-law, just like Abu Bakr also was a father-in-law to the Prophet, because their daughters were married. One was the father of Aisha, the other one was the father of Hafsa. Now, what is very interesting here, as we look at the history of Islam in the Middle East, is that the Prophet's followers were faithful enough to resist this rising tide of opposition. There was also a political question with regard to the very foundation of Islamic presence in Medina, because the members of the Ansar, those who are called the helpers, the Ansar, were now beginning to call for the support of one of their own to emerge as the chief of this emerging movement. But that was immediately nipped in the bud by Abu Bakr and Umar bin Khattab and Abu Ubaidah. When they met with them, they prevail on the Ansar. And of course, the immigrants from Mecca rally around their leaders, and of course, this changed the course of Islamic history. So if you talk about the history of the Islam in the Middle East, those were very critical moments. You heard what Professor Jackson told you about some of the tensions that took place and how you had these wars between the Meccans and the Muslim refugees in Medina. One point I want to make here with regard to the political crisis is the fact that these political crises that develop would begin to affect Muslim history in later years. Because once Abu Bakr succeeded the Prophet as his Khalifa, you have elements who felt that Ali, the cousin, and the son-in-law should have been considered. But Ali was still young, so he did not pose any kind of threat to Abu Bakr or to Umar bin Khattab. But Umar bin Khattab would be there for over 10 years. So during that time, he was able to do a lot for Muslims. And Islam was now beginning, this is where you go back to the geography of Islam. Islam now began to move beyond the Arabian Peninsula, now beginning to encroach into the domains of the Byzantines. Remember, the Middle East has been subjected to conquest by a wave of civilizations. Those Middle Easterners, if you were to have, in their days, telephone books, every century or so, the names on the telephone books will look like the names of the dominant civilization. And the Egyptians, of course, have been the most dominated by foreigners. Because if you look at Egyptian history, you see that so clearly, that they take on the names of the dominant groups who come and conquer them. And that came right through our own times. You see, when the British were the last one to get out of Egypt, and you still have some Egyptians, who are Anglo-Egyptians of some sort, in terms of, they have some names. Most Egyptians have Arabic names, but you have some Egyptians who have English names. Like they're not many, but they exist. And this is likely because of that period with Lord Cromer and when the English were dominant in that region. And you can see that very clearly among Lebanese. I mean, many of those Egyptians and Lebanese and Syrians who are very much influenced by the West, they migrated in terms of name. The Arabs in the earlier period have biblical names, but they sound like Arab names. Like the name Yahya. Yahya, for them, is John. But with the influence of the West, many of the Arabs whose names are Yahya will change their names to John because it sounds more Western. Your name is Peter, Putros. Like you call yourself Peter. Your name is Yusuf. You take the name Joseph. And you can see that. Some of you have been in the Middle East, you know what I'm talking about. Now, what I'm saying is that if you talk about Islam in the Middle East, what you have to recognize is the fact that after the death of the Prophet, you have the succession. And Abu Bakr was able to fight the Ridda wars, thereby putting an end to opposition. That's one of the major accomplishments of Abu Bakr, challenging the people who wanted to wage war because they wanted to put themselves up as the historical parallels to Muhammad, the Prophet, that they were two prophets. Abu Bakr was also able to put an end to a very dangerous doctrine that could have developed with Omar, as I said. Now, with the death of Abu Bakr and the rise of Omar, the Muslims are now beginning to move into the domain of the Greco-Roman world, because the Greco-Roman world affected many of those people. They influenced the Arabs to the point that some of the Arabs were very much affected by the Roman culture. And some of the other Arabs, the Ghazanids, some of the other Arabs, the Himyara, those from the south, near Yemen, were very much influenced by the Persians. So you have Arabs in the south who were very much influenced by the Persians, and then you have the Arabs in the north, in the Syria area, who were influenced by the Greeks and the Romans. Now, what is remarkable here with regard to Islam in the Middle East is that as the Muslims became stronger militarily to the point that they were now beginning to encroach into these areas, and many of those areas now, we call them Syria, Palestine, Jordan, Israel, those areas that we now give these names were Roman provinces. You recognize that even during the time of Jesus Christ, that area was called Roman Palestine. Roman Palestine. That's how they were called, Roman Palestine. Now, as a result of Roman influence, many of the people in that region were very much affected. You see that very clearly. I always remind people that if you read the Acts of the Apostles and you read about Paul, you will find that Paul was very much like what I call a third world intellectual today. He was a Jewish third world intellectual in the Roman Empire. Because whenever Paul ran into trouble, he flashes his Roman citizenship. You see that in the Gospels. So the Romans were very influential in that region, so were the Persians. Now, the Muslims would change that. Because by the time Omar died, the Muslims were now moving further into these areas. And Muslim generals like Khalid bin Walid were able to conquer more and more territories for the Muslims, and the Muslim armies were now beginning to move towards the Persian region. All of a sudden, those Persians were now beginning to witness Muslim encroachment into their areas. And the Muslims will gradually establish themselves in areas we now call the Fertile Crescent, Iraq, going towards Iran. So gradually, the Muslims will begin to move. But while this geography of Islam is changing, the history of Islam is also becoming more and more complex, because the tribalism that was talked about with the Arabs was beginning to take its toll. Uthman bin Affan was a favorite of the Prophet. In fact, you had the Muslims going to Mecca, and they have the Treaty of Hudaybiyyah. Hudaybiyyah was a very critical moment for the Muslims. Uthman bin Affan was a Muslim negotiator, because Abu Sufyan, remember you were told that when the Muslims encountered the Meccans at Badr, many of the leaders of the dominant group were wiped out. And a fellow whose descendants will play a very important role in the subsequent history of Islam, Abu Sufyan, who is a cousin of this. It's a very complicated, it's family feud. The history of Islam really is history, family feud. Uthman is a cousin of Abu Sufyan. And I told you that Abu Sufyan's daughter became one of the wives of the Prophet after she lost her husband in Abyssinia, Habiba. Now, by the time Uthman was the Khalifa, the Muslims were now a force to be reckoned with, because they have now dealt serious blows against the Persians and these Romans, the Byzantines, the Greek wing of the Roman Empire. We make a distinction between them. The Latin speakers and the Greek speakers, Roman Empire, the Byzantine and the Roman wing. Now, the Muslims were dealing more with the Byzantine Christians, not with the Romans. They're on the other end. Remember, the Roman Empire collapsed, and you have the different wings of the Roman Empire. Now, the thing is, by the time Uthman came to power, Islam in the Middle East was now a force to be reckoned with. They have their book, they have their community, which was a religio-political community, they had their armed forces, and they were able to deal with the different forces that were dominant. In fact, one thing I tell Muslims is that if you really look for historical parallel, you have to remember that during the Cold War, the existence of the Soviet Union and the United States paralleled the Sasanians and the Byzantines. These were the two dominant forces. And both of them had their allies, just like America and Russia had their allies among the Middle Easterners. That was the background for you to understand how Islam in the Middle East manifested itself. Because the two dominant powers were fighting each other. There's a whole chapter in the Quran, the Rum chapter, which talks about the defeat of the Persians by the Romans. And the Muslims would be the beneficiaries of this battle to exertion of these two forces. Because with the collapse of the Sasanians and the Byzantines, the Muslims gradually emerge as a force to be reckoned with in what we now call the Middle East. Now, of course, as Americans, what you have to remember is that the term Middle East, since I'm talking about the geography, the history, and the psychology of Islam, the word Middle East itself was a term coined by an American. The people there never called themselves Middle East. The British called them Near Easterners. But an American naval officer by the name of Mahan coined that term. Today, the Israelis and the Arabs and the Persians and the Afghans, they all see themselves as Middle Easterners. So, the time of the Prophet, that region belonged to different civilizations. So when we talk about Islam in the Middle East, what we have to recognize is the fact that by the time Uthman came to power and was ruling, his clan was increasingly gaining greater visibility, even though they were among the strongest opponents of the Islamic movement. And as history would have it, when he was assassinated by mutineers from Egypt, because he was assassinated, that's one of the tragedies of Islam, that Abu Bakr died, but Omar was assassinated by a Persian slave, Uthman would be assassinated by mutineers, and Ali would be assassinated as well. So you have these political assassinations, which was very deadly in the early history of Islam. And that became part of the legacy of political violence, in Islamic history. Now, before Uthman was killed, some of his own relatives were appointed to key positions by Umar bin Khattab. Muawiyah, who will now become a major figure, Muawiyah here, who would change the paradigm of political governance among Muslims. Because remember when you were told that when Islam came to Arabia, the Arabs did not have the notion of kingship. They had the notion of a sheikh of the tribe. And you now understand that concept very well. What has happened is that as the Muslims became more and more dominant and more prominent, the consolidation of power in the hands of some of the people from some of those tribal groups in Mecca would gradually set the stage for the idea of having a king, because that was a revolutionary transformation. The Prophet never saw himself as a king, because Islam brought to the Middle Eastern people not only the idea, among the Arabs, to to the Arabs the idea of a people of the book, believe in one God, recognizing the fact that there is a hereafter, that you are going to be judged by God in the end of times. And the Quran also made it very clear that you now have a brotherhood of humankind, and that your loyalty is based not on blood ties, but on a community of faith, F-A-I-T-H.